London is shrouded in fog. Where others see chaos, he finds the truth. The legendary detective Sherlock Holmes is back. Welcome to the channel. Put on your headphones, like the video, and subscribe. Let's begin. It is not without hesitation that I set down the particulars of the affair which I have entitled Sherlock Holmes Uncovered a Conspiracy. Britain kept silent about, for even now, years after the events themselves have passed into the quiet obscurity of sealed files and private recollections, I am conscious of an invisible pressure urging restraint. There are cases, my readers must understand, which are withheld from publication not for want of interest nor deficiency of proof, but because their full illumination would cast too searching a light upon institutions whose authority depends upon shadow. This, above all others, was such a case. The winter of 1894 had settled upon London with a tenacity that seemed almost personal. A yellow-grey fog lay coiled along the streets like a living thing, creeping into doorways, muffling the sound of carriage wheels, and imparting to even the most familiar thoroughfares an air of unease. Baker Street, usually brisk with purposeful movement, appeared subdued beneath the pall, its lamps glowing faintly as though reluctant to announce themselves. It was upon one such afternoon, when the day had scarcely distinguished itself from the approaching evening, that the matter first intruded upon our quiet routine. Holmes and I had spent the greater part of the morning in our customary occupations. My friend, stretched languidly upon the sofa with his long fingers steepled beneath his chin, was engaged in one of those periods of intense mental withdrawal which I had learned to recognize as the prelude to significant intellectual labor. His eyes, half-lidded, seemed fixed upon nothing at all, yet I knew better than to disturb him. I myself was occupied with a medical journal, though I confess my attention wandered repeatedly to the view beyond the window, where the fog thickened with each passing minute. "You observe, Watson," Holmes remarked suddenly, without altering his posture, "that the city has chosen today to wear its most deceptive face." I laid my journal aside. "Deceptive?" I repeated. "It appears merely dreary." "Just so," said he. "Dreary things invite neglect. Neglect breeds error. Error, when properly guided, becomes opportunity." Before I could inquire further into this cryptic observation, there came a knock at the door below, firm, measured, and executed with a precision that immediately distinguished it from the casual caller. Mrs. Hudson's footsteps followed, and moments later she ushered into our sitting room a gentleman whose appearance struck me at once as incongruous with his evident agitation. He was a man of perhaps 45 years, tall, well-proportioned, and dressed with understated elegance. His dark coat bore the mark of a first-rate tailor, yet its collar was turned up in a manner suggesting haste rather than affectation. A neatly trimmed beard framed a face of intellectual cast, though now strained by anxiety. His eyes, sharp and grey, moved quickly about the room before settling upon Holmes with unmistakable recognition. "Mr. Sherlock Holmes?" he asked. Holmes inclined his head. "You have found him. Pray be seated. You are troubled." The man hesitated, as though weighing the wisdom of speaking freely, then accepted the chair opposite Holmes. "My name is Edward Langdale," he said. "I was advised, unofficially, to consult you regarding a matter which the authorities have chosen to dismiss." Holmes's fingers twitched ever so slightly. Dismissal is often the first refuge of those unwilling to inquire. Pray continue. Langdale drew a breath. 3 weeks ago, my younger brother, Thomas Langdale, was found dead near the Paddington railway yards. The coroner ruled it an accident, a fall from a signal platform in the early hours of the morning. The case was closed within days. I take it, I interjected, that you disagree with this conclusion. With every fibre of my being, Langdale replied, his composure faltering for the first time. My brother was a cautious man. He had no reason to be near those yards at that hour, and yet his watch had stopped precisely at 2:30. More troubling still, certain papers he carried habitually were missing when his body was recovered. Holmes leaned forward at last, his eyes now keen with interest. What papers? Langdale hesitated again. I cannot say precisely. Thomas was employed as a clerk in the Admiralty Records Office. His work was confidential, though not, so far as I knew, dangerous. In the days preceding his death, however, he was restless. He spoke of inconsistencies, of documents that did not align with established accounts. He believed, Langdale broke off, lowering his voice, that certain events, long accepted as historical fact, had been deliberately misrepresented. A silence fell upon the room, heavy with implication. Outside, a carriage passed, its wheels reduced by the fog to a soft, ghostly rumble. "And you brought these concerns to the police?" Holmes asked. "I did." Inspector Holloway listened politely, then advised me to allow the dead to rest. He suggested that my grief had led me to imagine significance where none existed. Langdale's mouth tightened. Yet, within days of my inquiries, I was visited by a gentleman who declined to give his name, but who advised, firmly, that I cease my efforts. Holmes's lips curved in a faint, mirthless smile. Anonymity is a favorite cloak of authority when it fears recognition. Langdale rose abruptly from his chair and crossed to the window, peering out as though expecting to see that same unnamed visitor materialize from the fog. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I am not a fanciful man. I have served the Crown faithfully for over 20 years. But I know when fear has entered a conversation uninvited." That man was afraid, not of me, but of what my brother may have uncovered. Holmes rose as well, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the room. "You did well to come here, Mr. Langdale," he said quietly. "Tell me, was anything returned to you from your brother's effects?" "Only this," Langdale replied, producing from his coat pocket a small leather notebook, worn at the edges. "It was found in his lodgings, not upon his person. The police dismissed it as a personal journal of no consequence." Holmes accepted the notebook without opening it. He weighed it in his hand, as though assessing not its mass, but its potential. "Appearances," he said softly, "are the most cooperative of liars." As Langdale took his leave some minutes later, I could not shake the impression that we had crossed an invisible threshold. Holmes stood motionless by the fire, the little notebook still unopened, his gaze fixed upon the dancing flames. "Do you believe," I asked at last, "that Langdale's suspicions are justified?" Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he placed the notebook carefully upon the table, beside a magnifying lens and a half-consumed pipe. "What I believe, Watson," he said, "is that accidents which close too neatly deserve to be reopened. This one, I suspect, was sealed not by ignorance, but by design." He reached for the notebook at last, opening it to the first page. I caught only a glimpse of cramped handwriting and a curious repetition of dates before he closed it again. "We shall begin tomorrow," he concluded. "Tonight, let the city think itself safe in its silence." It was then, as the fog pressed more insistently against the window panes and the fire burned low, that I first felt the faint chill of a realization I could not yet articulate. That we had been invited, not merely to solve a death, but to trespass upon a truth others had labored diligently to conceal. The morning that followed our interview with Mr. Edward Langdale dawned with deceptive clarity. The fog, which had so persistently smothered Baker Street during the previous days, had lifted somewhat, revealing a pale winter sun that glinted weakly upon the damp pavements. Yet the city retained an air of restraint, as though it had merely drawn back a curtain rather than changed its mood. London, I have learned, is never truly transparent. It merely chooses different degrees of opacity. Holmes was awake and active long before I emerged from my room. When I entered the sitting room shortly after 8 o'clock, I found him seated at the table by the window, the small leather notebook laid open before him, surrounded by an array of familiar instruments: magnifying lens, chemical reagents, loose sheets of paper densely covered in his spidery handwriting. His pipe rested untouched nearby, a sure sign that his mind was already fully engaged. "You slept well, Watson?" he asked without looking up. "Reasonably," I replied, though in truth my rest had been unsettled by dreams of railway lines vanishing into fog and clocks that refused to mark the hour. "You appear to have begun without me." "I began the moment Mr. Langdale left the room," Holmes said calmly. "Sleep is a concession I grant only when the problem permits." He gestured for me to draw nearer, and I took the chair opposite him. The notebook lay open at a page densely filled with neat but cramped handwriting. At first glance, it appeared unremarkable, a private journal of observations, dates, and personal remarks. Yet, even to my untrained eye, there was an odd quality to the arrangement, as though the author had been recording more than he wished to reveal at a single reading. "This," Holmes said, tapping the page lightly, "is what Inspector Holloway dismissed as inconsequential." I leaned forward, scanning the lines. "It seems a simple diary. Notes about work, occasional comments on the weather, references to meetings, and a conspicuous absence of emotional reflection," Holmes interrupted. "Observe, Watson, how Mr. Thomas Langdale writes of matters personal. His mother's illness is recorded in precisely the same tone as a delayed train. Such restraint suggests either an exceptionally dull temperament or a deliberate discipline." I nodded slowly. "You believe he was concealing something?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that he was writing for two audiences, himself and any reader who might come upon the notebook unintentionally." He turned several pages, stopping at a sequence of entries that repeated a curious pattern. Each began with a date, followed by a brief reference to a document number or archive designation, then concluded with a seemingly trivial observation: a comment on a misplaced file, an incorrect date, or an annotation that did not correspond with the primary record. "For example," Holmes continued, "here, February 3rd, file A1742 reviewed, marginal notation inconsistent, ink composition differs, tea cold by the time I finished." I frowned. "That does not strike me as especially alarming." "Precisely," Holmes said. "It is meant not to. Yet note the recurrence of such remarks, always paired with specific files, always understated. Mr. Langdale was cataloguing discrepancies. "And the comments about ink?" I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed faintly. "Ink ages, Watson. Its chemical composition can reveal when a document was written, regardless of the date it bears. A marginal note written decades later but presented as contemporary is a small lie. But small lies, when repeated systematically, support large ones." He closed the notebook and rose. "Come, we shall pay a visit to Paddington." The railway yards at Paddington presented a scene of organized chaos. Engines hissed and clanked upon the tracks. Porters shouted orders above the din, and the smell of coal smoke hung heavily in the cold air. Holmes moved through the bustle with effortless purpose, his eyes absorbing details with that peculiar intensity which had so often amazed me. We located the signal platform from which Thomas Langdale was said to have fallen. It was a narrow structure, elevated above the tracks, accessible only by a steep iron ladder. Holmes examined the ladder first, running his fingers along the rungs, then crouched to inspect the base. "Notice anything?" he asked. I looked closely. "The ground seems uneven, disturbed." "Indeed," Holmes said, "though not as one would expect from a fall. The earth here has been compacted, not scattered. And there," he pointed to a faint scrape along the edge of the platform. "A lateral mark, Watson, suggestive of contact while standing, not while falling." "You mean?" "I mean," Holmes replied quietly, "that Mr. Langdale may not have fallen at all." We were interrupted by the approach of a railway foreman, a stout man with a wary expression. Holmes introduced himself merely as an interested party conducting private inquiries. The foreman's initial reluctance softened when Holmes produced a card bearing an unfamiliar crest. One I later learned was entirely fictitious. "Did anyone see Mr. Langdale on the night of his death?" Holmes asked. The foreman scratched his chin. "There was a watchman on duty, Evans. Said he saw a gentleman matching the description near the platform around 2 o'clock. Thought nothing of it at the time." "And after?" Holmes pressed. "Evans was reassigned 2 days later," the foreman said slowly. "Transferred to a different yard. No explanation given." Holmes thanked him and turned away, his expression unreadable. As we left the yards, Holmes remarked, "A witness removed, a site inadequately examined, and a conclusion reached with suspicious haste. All consistent with an accident, if one wishes it so." Our next destination was less public. Through inquiries conducted with his customary discretion, Holmes had ascertained the address of Inspector Holloway. We found him at his office, a cramped room redolent of stale tobacco and bureaucratic fatigue. Holloway received us with thinly veiled irritation. "The Langdale matter is closed," he said curtly. "I see no reason to reopen it." "Nor did I ask you to," Holmes replied smoothly. "I merely wished to clarify a point. Did you examine the contents of Mr. Langdale's notebook?" Holloway hesitated. "Briefly. Nothing of note." "And the missing papers?" Holmes persisted. "Unaccounted for," Holloway admitted. "Likely misplaced. Clerks are careless." Holmes leaned closer. "Or deliberately relieved of inconvenient material." Holloway's eyes flickered. "Be careful, Mr. Holmes." Holmes smiled faintly. "Carefulness is my profession." We departed soon after, leaving Holloway visibly unsettled. Outside, Holmes paused, gazing up at the grey sky. "They are nervous," he said. "That is encouraging." "Encouraging?" I echoed. "It suggests," Holmes replied, "that we are walking in the correct direction." That evening, as Holmes resumed his study of the notebook, I reflected upon the subtle shifts in the case. What had begun as a suspected murder was already expanding into something less tangible and more troubling. A pattern of suppression, quiet transfers, and altered records. As the clock struck 11, Holmes suddenly closed the notebook with decisive finality. "Watson," he said, "tell me, have you ever considered how history is written?" "By those who record it," I answered cautiously. "Or by those who permit it to be recorded," Holmes corrected. Mr. Langdale stumbled upon an inconsistency that threatened to unravel a carefully maintained narrative. His death was not the cause of the conspiracy, but its consequence. "And the conspiracy itself?" I asked. Holmes's gaze drifted to the window where the fog was beginning once more to gather. "That," he said softly, "remains to be uncovered. But I assure you, it reaches far beyond a single clerk or a single fall." He turned back to the table and reopened the notebook, his finger resting upon a page marked only with a date and a single cryptic line. "Cross-reference confirms erasure." What, I wondered, had been erased, and by whom? The phrase "cross-reference confirms erasure" lingered in my thoughts long after Holmes had retired to his room, leaving the notebook upon the table as though it were a thing that might move of its own accord if left unwatched. I slept poorly that night, troubled by the sense that we were no longer merely pursuing the truth of one man's death, but brushing against the outer wall of something vast, deliberate, and watchful. Morning brought little relief. Holmes emerged from his room already dressed for the day, his manner brisk, yet inwardly focused, as if he were carrying on a dialogue with himself that required no audience. "We shall go to Whitehall," he announced over a sparse breakfast. "Specifically to the Admiralty Records Office." I raised an eyebrow. "With official permission?" Holmes allowed himself the faintest smile. "With sufficient plausibility." The journey took us through streets that seemed, to my heightened sensibilities, unusually alert. Everywhere I looked, I saw men whose gazes lingered a moment too long, clerks who paused in their conversations as we passed, carriage drivers who adjusted their pace with inexplicable precision. Whether these impressions were grounded in fact or the product of my own growing unease, I could not say. Holmes, at any rate, appeared unconcerned. The Admiralty Records Office occupied a severe stone building whose exterior spoke eloquently of authority and restraint. Its windows were narrow, its entrance guarded not by soldiers, but by clerks, men whose power lay not in arms, but in access. Holmes approached the desk with the ease of one accustomed to command attention without demanding it. "We are here," he said, producing a carefully prepared letter, "to review a selection of files pertaining to naval logistics in the early 70s. The clerk, a thin fellow with pince-nez perched precariously upon his nose, examined the letter with meticulous care. "These files are restricted," he said at last. "Access is limited." Holmes leaned slightly closer. "Limited," he agreed, "but not prohibited. Note the signature." The clerk's eyes widened imperceptibly. He nodded and gestured for us to follow. We were led into a reading room whose silence was so profound it seemed to absorb sound itself. Rows of shelves rose along the walls, each bearing the weight of recorded history. I could not help but feel that we were intruders in a sanctuary, and that the sanctuary knew it. Holmes requested a specific sequence of files, citing references identical to those in Thomas Langdale's notebook. The clerk returned with a stack of folders bound in faded ribbon. "Observe," Holmes murmured as the clerk withdrew, "the condition of these bindings. Some are markedly newer than others." He opened the first file with deliberate care. Inside were reports, memoranda, and correspondence, all neatly arranged. At first glance, everything appeared in order. Dates aligned. Signatures were present. Nothing seemed amiss. Yet Holmes's attention was fixed upon the margins. "Here," he said softly, indicating a note written in a different hand. "This annotation purports to be contemporary with the document. Yet the ink..." He produced a small vial and applied a minute quantity of reagent. The color shifted subtly. "Is of a formulation not commonly used until nearly a decade later." "You mean it was added afterward?" I whispered. "Yes, and more importantly, it was added with the intention of appearing original." As we progressed through the files, the pattern repeated itself. Marginal notes correcting dates, clarifying decisions, subtly redirecting interpretation. Each alteration was minor. Taken together, they formed a quiet but decisive redirection of the historical record. Holmes closed one file and sat back. "Mr. Langdale was correct," he said. "These documents have been curated." "By whom?" I asked. Holmes did not answer at once. Instead, he requested another set of files, these pertaining not to naval logistics, but to railway transport during the same period. Again, discrepancies emerged, dates adjusted, responsibilities reassigned, incidents minimized. As we worked, a man entered the reading room, a tall figure with iron-grey hair and an air of effortless authority. He paused, observing us with a gaze that was at once polite and penetrating. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "I wondered when you might appear." Holmes rose. "Sir Reginald Ashcroft," he replied. "Your reputation precedes you." Ashcroft smiled thinly. "As does yours. May I inquire as to the nature of your interest in these materials?" "I am assisting a private inquiry," Holmes said. "One that appears to intersect with your department's past activities." Ashcroft's eyes flicked briefly to the open files. "History is a complex tapestry," he said. "It does not benefit from excessive tugging at loose threads." "On the contrary," Holmes replied evenly, "truth often depends upon it." Ashcroft stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There are truths," he said, "that serve no constructive purpose. Revealing them would invite misunderstanding, unrest, and a loss of confidence in institutions that safeguard the nation." "And yet," Holmes countered, "those institutions rest upon public trust." Ashcroft regarded him steadily. "Trust is maintained by stability, Mr. Holmes, not by indiscriminate exposure." A charged silence followed. Then Ashcroft straightened. "I would advise you to redirect your considerable talents to less sensitive matters." Holmes inclined his head. Advice noted. Ashcroft departed without another word. As we gathered our things, I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the drafty room. "He was warning you," I said. "He was measuring us," Holmes replied, "and I suspect he did not like the result." We left the building under the watchful eyes of the clerks. Outside, Holmes paused, his expression thoughtful. "They are not criminals in the ordinary sense," he said. "They believe themselves custodians of a necessary fiction." "And Thomas Langdale?" I asked. Was an inconvenient idealist, Holmes replied, one who mistook accuracy for innocence. That evening, back in Baker Street, Holmes resumed his study of the notebook. He traced a sequence of references that led not to documents, but to places, railway junctions, warehouses, offices that no longer existed. This, he said, tapping the page, is the skeleton of a logistical operation. Supplies moved, not as recorded, but as required by circumstances that were never officially acknowledged. Circumstances such as, I ventured. Holmes closed the notebook. That, he said, is the question they were so eager to erase. A knock sounded at the door, sharp, insistent. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Mrs. Hudson entered, pale. "There is a man below," she said. "He insists on seeing you at once. He would not give his name." Holmes's eyes narrowed. "Show him up." As we waited, I could not shake the feeling that the walls themselves were listening, and that whatever truth lay buried within those altered records was already beginning to stir. The unnamed visitor ascended the stairs with a measured tread that struck me at once as deliberate rather than hesitant. It was not the step of a man uncertain of his welcome, nor of one accustomed to command unquestioned entry, but rather of someone who had calculated the exact degree of confidence required for the occasion. Holmes, standing beside the mantel, observed the door with that stillness which always preceded his most acute attentions. The man who entered was of middle height, spare in build, and dressed in a fashion that aimed at anonymity through respectability. His coat was well cut but unremarkable, his hat carefully brushed, his gloves immaculate. It was his face, however, that held my gaze, pale, sharp-featured, and marked by an expression of habitual restraint. The eyes were the most telling feature, grey, steady, and burdened with an intelligence that had learned the cost of curiosity. He inclined his head slightly. "Mr. Holmes, Dr. Watson." "You have the advantage of us," Holmes replied. "Pray sit down." The man did so, placing his hat upon his knee rather than the table, as though unwilling to relinquish even a minor possession. For a moment he seemed to gather his thoughts, then spoke in a low, even voice. "My name is not important," he said. "What is important is that you are being observed." Watson, myself, felt an involuntary tightening in the chest. Holmes, however, merely raised an eyebrow. Observation is hardly unusual in my profession. "This is not ordinary scrutiny," the man continued. "Your movements since yesterday morning have been noted. Your visit to Paddington, your presence at the Admiralty Records Office, your conversation with Sir Reginald Ashcroft." Holmes's expression did not change, but I saw his fingers flex slightly. "And you bring this intelligence as a courtesy?" "As a warning," the man replied. "There are those who believe you are approaching matters better left undisturbed." "And you?" Holmes asked. The man hesitated. "I believe that silence, when enforced, is a form of falsehood, but I also believe in survival." Holmes gestured toward the chair opposite him. "Then we share at least one conviction. Tell me, what became of Thomas Langdale?" The man's gaze dropped to his gloved hands. "He found a pattern," he said, "one that extended beyond clerical error or bureaucratic convenience. He believed that certain military movements during the early 70s had been misattributed in the official record." "Misattributed how?" I asked. "Assigned to foreign provocations," the man replied, when in fact they were internal responses to an event the government chose never to acknowledge. Holmes leaned forward. "An event of what nature?" The man looked up sharply. I do not know, or rather, I know only fragments, enough to understand that it involved loss, significant loss, and a decision made at the highest levels to conceal that loss beneath a more palatable narrative. And Mr. Langdale, Holmes prompted, was not content to let the matter rest, the man said quietly. He cross-referenced shipping manifests, railway logs, and casualty lists. He noticed discrepancies, numbers that did not reconcile, names that appeared twice under different circumstances. A man counting ghosts, Holmes murmured. The visitor's lips tightened. Yes, and ghosts, Mr. Holmes, are dangerous things to acknowledge. I found myself leaning forward. You suggest his death was arranged? The man did not answer directly. I suggest, he said, that his death was convenient. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, peering out into the fog-veiled street below. You are taking a considerable risk in coming here. I am, the man agreed, but I believe you are the only one capable of discerning the truth without proclaiming it indiscriminately. Holmes turned back. You believe, then, the truth may be selectively handled. The man met his gaze. I believe that revelation without preparation can be as destructive as deception. A silence followed, dense with implication. At last, Holmes spoke. You have given us little that is concrete. I can give you one thing more, the man said, reaching into his coat. He produced a folded sheet of paper and placed it upon the table. This is a copy of a memorandum circulated briefly within the Home Office before being withdrawn. I retained it because I was instructed to destroy it. Holmes took the paper and read it carefully. I watched his face for some sign of reaction, but he betrayed none. When he finished, he handed it to me. The memorandum was brief, couched in cautious language. It referred to the incident of March 1871, to unanticipated casualties, and to the necessity of narrative consolidation. It concluded with a directive that all references be harmonized under an existing foreign engagement. This is extraordinary, I murmured. It is incomplete, Holmes said, but its very existence confirms intent. The man stood. I have said all I dare. After tonight, I will deny this conversation ever took place. One more question, Holmes said. Why come to us at all? The man hesitated, then answered simply. Because if the truth is to remain buried, it should at least be buried consciously, not through ignorance. He departed as quietly as he had come. For some time after, neither Holmes nor I spoke. At last, Holmes folded the memorandum and placed it beside Langdale's notebook. We now have motive, he said, but motive without mechanism is conjecture. And the mechanism? I asked. Holmes's eyes gleamed. Will be found where records intersect with reality. We must locate those whose lives were altered by this concealed incident. How? I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. By following the dead who were never acknowledged. That night, as I prepared for bed, I could not shake the sense that the city itself had grown heavier, as though burdened by a truth it had long suppressed. Somewhere in London, I felt certain, there were men who knew we were drawing closer, and who would not hesitate to ensure that Thomas Langdale was not the last to suffer for it. And still, the true nature of the incident of March 1871 remained hidden, like a wound concealed beneath layers of carefully applied bandage, threatening infection the moment it was exposed. Holmes rose earlier than usual the following morning, and when I joined him in the sitting room, I found him already deep in correspondence. Several sheets of paper spread before him, each covered with lists of names, dates, and locations written in his precise hand. The fire had burned low, yet he seemed oblivious to the cold, his mind clearly engaged upon some internal architecture invisible to me. "You are awake early," I remarked. "I have not slept," Holmes replied calmly. "Sleep would have been an indulgence." He gestured for me to sit, then handed me one of the papers. "These are casualty records," he said, "or rather, fragments of them." I scanned the list. The names were unremarkable, common English surnames paired with Christian names equally unexceptional. Beside each were dates clustered around March of 1871, and occupations: dock worker, railway porter, naval stoker, warehouse clerk. "These men died?" I asked. "Officially," Holmes replied, "many of them did not. Some were listed as having emigrated. Others were recorded as discharged from service, with no further notation. A few were marked as deceased, but under unrelated circumstances, months or years later." "You believe these records were altered?" "I am certain of it," Holmes said. "What is more, Thomas Langdale was certain of it before me." Holmes rose and paced the room. "Consider the scale of the operation implied by the memorandum we received. Unanticipated casualties suggests not a handful of deaths, but dozens, perhaps more, too many to conceal through simple omission. Thus, identities were reassigned, fates redistributed across time and geography." "A reshuffling of the dead," I murmured. "Precisely," Holmes said. "And reshuffling leaves patterns, Watson, for it is constrained by administrative necessity. One cannot simply erase a man who has family, employment, and documentation. One must transform him into someone else, or into no one at all." "And you intend to find these men?" "Or what remains of them," Holmes replied. Our first destination that day was an address in Limehouse, where one of the names on Holmes's list, Samuel Breckenridge, had last been recorded as residing before his supposed emigration to Canada. The house stood in a narrow street close to the river, its brickwork darkened by years of smoke and damp. An elderly woman answered our knock, peering at us with suspicion sharpened by poverty. "Samuel Breckenridge," she repeated. "I knew a man by that name. Lived here, he did. Lodged with my husband and me." "What became of him?" Holmes asked gently. Her expression shifted, uncertainty clouding her features. "He left," she said. "At least, that's what they told me." "Who told you?" I asked. "Men from an office," she replied. "Said Sam had been offered work abroad, paid his arrears, took his things." "And you saw him leave?" Holmes pressed. She shook her head slowly. "No, never did." Holmes thanked her, and we departed, leaving behind a silence heavy with unspoken doubt. Similar visits followed throughout the day. In Bermondsey, a former shipmate recalled a man who had vanished between voyages, his belongings removed by strangers claiming authority. In Camden Town, a widow spoke of a brother who had ceased writing abruptly, later declared dead of fever in a city he had never visited. Each account differed in detail, yet the structure was the same. Disappearance followed by explanation, explanation supported by paperwork, paperwork accepted without question. By late afternoon, my head swam with names and stories, each one a small tragedy swallowed by the machinery of the state. Holmes, however, appeared invigorated, his eyes bright with the energy of connection. They believed these men to be insignificant, he said, as we walked back toward Baker Street. And in most respects, they were. But insignificance, when multiplied, becomes magnitude. That evening, Holmes spread his papers upon the table, arranging them not chronologically, but spatially. Lines were drawn, connections traced. "Observe," he said, indicating a cluster of names, all associated with logistics, transport, supply, movement. None were officers. None held rank. They were the hands that moved things quietly. "And something went wrong," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied. "Something went catastrophically wrong." A knock interrupted us. This time it was Mrs. Hudson bearing a telegram. Holmes read it, his expression darkening. "Sir Reginald Ashcroft requests my presence tomorrow morning," he said. "Formally." "That sounds ominous," I remarked. "It is an escalation," Holmes agreed. "They have ceased to warn obliquely." The following morning found us once more in Whitehall, ushered into a private office furnished with austere elegance. Sir Reginald Ashcroft stood by the fireplace, his posture rigid. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "your activities have become a matter of concern." "I regret to hear it," Holmes replied. "Concern often accompanies discovery." Ashcroft's eyes hardened. "You are pursuing a narrative that, if aired, would undermine public confidence." "Confidence in what?" Holmes asked. "In truth?" Ashcroft exhaled sharply. "In governance, in stability, in the notion that those entrusted with power act in the nation's best interest." Holmes met his gaze. "Did they?" A charged silence followed. At last, Ashcroft spoke. "There was an incident," he admitted. "A logistical failure during a covert operation. Lives were lost. Exposure would have invited international condemnation." "So the truth was buried," Holmes said. "It was managed," Ashcroft corrected. "And for decades, that management has preserved peace." "And Thomas Langdale?" Holmes asked quietly. Ashcroft's jaw tightened. He threatened to unearth a past best left undisturbed. "By killing him?" I interjected, unable to restrain myself. Ashcroft did not answer directly. "Accidents happen," he said, "especially when men involve themselves in matters beyond their remit." Holmes rose. "Then you will not cooperate further." Ashcroft's voice dropped. "I will advise you, Mr. Holmes, for the last time, to abandon this inquiry." Holmes inclined his head. Advice noted. As we left the building, I felt a profound unease. "He all but confessed," I said. "He confessed to a philosophy," Holmes replied, "not to a crime." Back in Baker Street, Holmes resumed his work with renewed intensity. Late that night, he paused, his finger resting upon a name I had seen before. "Watson," he said slowly. "Do you recall the watchman at Paddington? Evans?" "Yes." "He appears on this list," Holmes said, "under a different designation. Reassigned indeed, but not merely transferred. He was involved." "In what way?" I asked. Holmes looked up, his expression grave. "In ensuring that the truth of March 1871 remained silent." A chill ran through me. If even minor functionaries had been co-opted into this long deception, how far did it truly extend? And how many men, like Thomas Langdale, had paid the price for daring to remember? The answer, I feared, was far greater than we yet understood. Holmes remained standing long after he had spoken Evans's name, his eyes fixed upon the papers before him, as though they concealed some further revelation, unwilling to declare itself at once. The silence that followed was not empty. It was weighted with implication, with the dawning realization that the conspiracy we traced was not confined to offices and memoranda, but had extended into the consciences of ordinary men. "Are you certain?" I asked at last. Evans struck me as little more than a dutiful watchman. Holmes nodded slowly. Dutiful men are the most useful instruments of secrecy. They obey without curiosity, and when curiosity awakens, it is already too late. He selected a single sheet from the pile and handed it to me. "Here, note the reassignment order." Evans was transferred not merely to another yard, but to a supervisory post created expressly for him. No prior qualifications, no competitive process. I examined the document. "A reward," I said. "Or a leash," Holmes replied. "Such promotions serve two purposes. They bind a man through gratitude and render his silence conspicuous." The following morning, Holmes resolved that we should seek Evans without delay. Through discreet inquiries, he learned that Evans now resided in a modest house on the outskirts of Croydon, far removed from the noise and anonymity of the central yards. The journey by train was uneventful, though I could not shake the sensation that our presence was being noted. Our movements quietly entered into some ledger unseen. Evans's house stood at the end of a narrow lane, its small garden neatly tended. A lace curtain twitched as we approached, then settled once more. Holmes knocked. The door was opened cautiously by a man of middle age, his hair greying at the temples, his posture slightly stooped. His eyes widened briefly at the sight of Holmes, then narrowed with suspicion. "Mr. Evans," Holmes said, "we would like a word." Evans hesitated. "I've done nothing wrong," he said. "Nor have we accused you," Holmes replied. "May we come in?" After a moment's deliberation, Evans stepped aside. The interior of the house was modest but orderly, every object in its place. Holmes took note of these details, as he always did, though he made no comment. "You were on duty at Paddington the night Thomas Langdale died," Holmes said once they were seated. Evans's shoulders tightened. "That was ruled an accident." "Indeed," Holmes said. "Yet you were transferred shortly thereafter." Evans's eyes flicked toward the door. "I was fortunate," he said. "That's all." Holmes leaned forward. "Fortune rarely arrives unannounced, Mr. Evans. Who spoke to you after that night?" Evans swallowed. "A gentleman," he said reluctantly. "From the Home Office, I think. He asked what I had seen." "And what had you seen?" I asked gently. Evans's hands trembled. "A struggle," he said. "Brief. 2 men, Langdale and another. I couldn't see the other's face." "Why did you not report this?" Holmes asked. "I tried," Evans said, "but I was told I must have been mistaken, that the fog plays tricks. Then they offered me the transfer." Holmes's voice was calm. "And you accepted?" Evans nodded miserably. "I have a family." Holmes sat back. "Did you ever see the other man again?" Evans hesitated, then nodded. "Once. Weeks later. He came to the yard where I'd been reassigned, just to look at me. Didn't say a word." "Can you describe him?" Holmes asked. "Tall," Evans said. "Well-dressed, military bearing." Holmes exchanged a glance with me. "Sir Reginald Ashcroft," he murmured. Evans's eyes widened. "I don't know his name," he said quickly. "But if that's who he is, then yes." Holmes rose. "Thank you, Mr. Evans. You have done more today than you know." As we departed, Evans called after us. "Be careful," he said. They don't forget. The warning echoed in my mind as we returned to London. Holmes was silent throughout the journey, his expression unreadable. Back in Baker Street, Holmes resumed his work with renewed urgency. He began constructing a timeline not of documents, but of human actions. Who had spoken to whom? Who had been reassigned, promoted, or silenced? They rely upon compartmentalization, he said. Each man knows only his part, but overlap is inevitable. That evening, Holmes received another visitor, this time a woman, veiled and visibly distressed. She identified herself as Margaret Hale, sister to one of the names on Holmes's list. "My brother vanished," she said. "They told us he had died abroad. But I never believed it." She produced a letter, never sent, written by her brother weeks after his supposed death. Holmes examined it closely. "The postmark?" I asked. "Absent," Holmes said, deliberately. Margaret Hale leaned forward. "You must tell me, did he suffer?" Holmes hesitated. "I cannot yet answer that." She nodded, tears in her eyes. "Then find the truth." After she left, Holmes stood by the window, staring into the fog. "They believed time would erase memory," he said. "But memory is stubborn." "Yet what can we do?" I asked. "Even if you uncover everything, will it change anything?" Holmes turned. "Perhaps not, but silence is complicity." Late that night, Holmes uncovered a further anomaly, an expenditure ledger authorizing payments to families of the vanished, disguised as pension adjustments. "Hush money," he said simply. As dawn approached, Holmes finally sat back, exhaustion etched upon his features. "We are nearing the core," he said, "and that is when danger becomes most acute." A sudden noise from the street below drew us both to the window. A man stood beneath the lamp, looking up at our rooms. When he saw us, he turned and disappeared into the fog. "They know," I said. "Yes," Holmes replied, "and now they will act." The game, it seemed, had entered a far more perilous phase. The man in the street had vanished as swiftly as he had appeared, swallowed by the ever-present fog that seemed to cloak not only London, but the very secrets we were so determined to uncover. Holmes remained at the window for several moments, his eyes narrowing as though he could still see the figure in the mist, his mind turning the details over with characteristic deliberation. "They are not hiding anymore," Holmes said quietly, more to himself than to me. "They are watching us." I joined him at the window, staring into the dim haze. "Do you think that was someone sent by Ashcroft? Or another player in this tangled web?" Holmes did not answer immediately. His gaze was fixed, but I knew that his mind was racing through 1,000 different possibilities, piecing together fragments of clues, considering motives, and evaluating the risks involved. "It could be either," he said eventually, his voice low but firm. "But there is one thing I'm certain of. This person meant us no harm. His presence was a message, not an attack. He was checking our position." I frowned. "A messenger of sorts?" Holmes turned to face me. "Precisely. There are men who operate in shadows, and then there are those who operate in plain sight, but only when they believe they are unobserved. This one is not content with remaining hidden, and his presence here tells me that he knows we are getting closer. But why now?" "Because we're drawing too much attention," I suggested. "Perhaps," Holmes mused. "Or perhaps because we've discovered enough to disrupt their plans." The tension between us was palpable, as Holmes walked to his desk, his fingers grazing the papers spread across it, as though seeking some elusive connection between them. His eyes were focused, calculating, but his mind was no longer simply sifting through evidence. It was hunting for something new, something that could turn the tide of this investigation in a new direction. "The watchman, Evans," Holmes said, his voice sharp as he fixed his gaze upon me, "was more than a mere bystander. He may have been instrumental in the operation, but I believe that something has shifted in him, something I did not account for." I met his gaze. "You think he was a willing accomplice?" Holmes shook his head. "Not entirely, but I do believe that the events of March 1871, whatever those events may have been, shattered his loyalty to the system that employed him. Evans was afraid, but he wasn't blind. I suspect that over the years he began to piece things together, perhaps even more than we have." I nodded slowly. "And now he's trying to make amends." "Perhaps," Holmes replied. "But one thing is certain, he has been far more involved in this than he realized, or perhaps more than he was willing to admit." Holmes turned back to the window, his eyes scanning the street once more. "We must move quickly. We are being followed, whether by Ashcroft's men or by others with a vested interest in preventing the truth from coming to light, I cannot yet say. But I believe the time for subtlety has passed." "What do you suggest?" I asked. Holmes's lips curled into a thin smile. "We need to draw them out. It is time to change the game." The next morning, we set in motion a plan that, if successful, would bring us one step closer to the elusive truth that had so far evaded us. Holmes had arranged for a meeting at a discreet location, an inconspicuous tea room off Fleet Street, where he believed someone within Ashcroft's circle might be inclined to speak without the oppressive weight of surveillance. We arrived early, as was our custom, and took a small, secluded table by the window. Holmes ordered tea with a casual air, though his eyes never stopped moving, scanning the room for anyone who might appear out of place. He was always like this when on the hunt, a hawk perched patiently, his gaze moving with a quiet intensity that saw more than the average observer might ever notice. I, for my part, was restless, the weight of the unknown pressing down upon me. It had been weeks since Langdale's death, and the mystery had grown more tangled with each passing day. The documents, the suspicious transfers, the erased records, each piece seemed to suggest a vast conspiracy, one that stretched far beyond a single man or a single event. But we had yet to find the key that would unlock the door to the entire truth. And yet, I could feel the tension in the air, a sense that something was about to give, that we were on the cusp of something monumental. At precisely 11 o'clock, as if on cue, a man entered the tea room. He was tall, with a military bearing, his sharp features almost too perfect, too deliberate. He was dressed in a dark suit, the kind of outfit one would wear to avoid drawing attention, but it had an air of understated refinement that belied its simplicity. He scanned the room briefly, his eyes alighting on Holmes almost immediately. Holmes did not react outwardly, but I saw his body tense, his eyes narrowing as the man made his way to our table and sat without invitation. "Mr. Holmes," the man said smoothly, his voice low and controlled, "I believe you've been looking for me." Holmes studied the man for a long moment before responding. And yet, I wasn't certain you would come. The man smiled faintly, but there was no warmth in it. Curiosity, Mr. Holmes, is often a stronger motivator than caution. You know why I'm here. Holmes leaned back in his chair, studying the man with his usual calm intensity. I believe I do. You're here to tell me to stop, but that won't happen, will it? The man's smile faltered, his eyes flicking to the door before returning to Holmes. No, Mr. Holmes. You are too deeply entrenched now, but you have no idea what you're dealing with. Holmes raised an eyebrow. And what is it exactly that I'm dealing with? The man's voice dropped lower, as though the very nature of his words could betray him. You're not just dealing with Sir Reginald Ashcroft. This goes far deeper. There are forces at play here. Men with power, men who would rather see the truth buried forever. I've always believed the truth has a way of revealing itself, Holmes replied, his tone sharp and unyielding. What is it you want? The man leaned forward, lowering his voice even further. I want you to understand the cost of what you're trying to uncover. The price is far higher than you think. There are people who will stop at nothing to ensure that the secrets of March 1871 remain hidden. Holmes's eyes flashed. I am well aware of the stakes, and I assure you, I am prepared to pay whatever price is required. The man's expression darkened. Then you are already lost, Mr. Holmes, and when this is over, you will understand that some truths are better left buried. Without another word, the man stood, his chair scraping harshly against the floor as he turned and made his way out of the tea room. I watched him go, my thoughts racing. Do you believe him? I asked quietly, after the man had disappeared into the fog outside. Holmes sat motionless for a long moment, his fingers steepled beneath his chin. I believe he speaks the truth, at least in part, he said slowly. But the nature of the truth, Watson, is rarely as simple as it first appears. I nodded, but a deep unease settled in my chest. Whoever this man was, he was right about one thing. This case was far more dangerous than I had imagined. We spent the rest of the day following leads that Holmes had arranged with characteristic discretion. We visited warehouses, interviewed former employees of the Admiralty, and pursued every possible clue that might illuminate the mysterious events of March 1871. Yet, despite our efforts, the pieces of the puzzle refused to fall into place. It was as if we were circling an invisible truth, one that remained just beyond our grasp. But I knew Holmes would not rest until he had uncovered every detail, no matter how well hidden, no matter how dangerous. And I, though weary and uncertain, would follow him to the end. By nightfall, I felt the weight of the conspiracy pressing heavily upon us. And though we had gathered much, the final piece of the puzzle, the piece that would reveal the full scope of the mystery, remained elusive. One thing, however, was certain. The more we uncovered, the more I realized that the shadow of those behind this great conspiracy stretched far beyond the walls of Whitehall. And we were not just investigating a crime anymore. We were uncovering a vast, coordinated deception, one that had been carefully crafted and protected for decades. The truth, when it finally came, would be far more dangerous than I had ever anticipated. The days that followed our encounter in the tea room were marked by an atmosphere of heightened vigilance. Holmes altered his routines subtly, but decisively. His hours became irregular, his routes unpredictable, his correspondence conducted through intermediaries whose loyalty he had tested long ago. To the casual observer, nothing had changed. To one who knew him as I did, every movement spoke of an intelligence acutely aware that the hunter was now also the hunted. For my own part, I confess that a persistent sense of apprehension accompanied even the most ordinary activities. The sound of footsteps behind me in the Strand, the pause of a cab too long at a crossing, the glance of a stranger held a second beyond propriety. All these things assumed exaggerated significance. Holmes, observing my unease, offered neither reassurance nor rebuke. "Fear sharpens perception, Watson," he remarked one evening as we sat before the fire. "Provided it does not dull judgment, it is a useful ally." It was on that same evening that Holmes introduced a new element into the case, one that, in retrospect, marked a decisive turning point. "You will recall," he said, "the memorandum referring to the incident of March 1871. Its language was careful, bureaucratic, and intentionally vague. Such documents are not written in isolation. They are echoes." "Echoes of what?" I asked. "Of a primary report," Holmes replied. "One that was never meant to circulate widely, and which was almost certainly destroyed." "Almost," I echoed. Holmes allowed himself a thin smile. "Destruction is rarely as thorough as its authors intend." He reached into a drawer and produced a slim folder, its edges worn, its cover unmarked. "This," he said, "was obtained at considerable risk by a man who no longer believes the silence he serves is justified." I opened the folder with care. Inside lay a single document, handwritten, its ink faded but legible. It bore no official crest, no signature, but its contents struck me at once as extraordinary. It was a report, plain, factual, and chillingly precise. It described a covert operation conducted on British soil in March of 1871, involving the transport and temporary containment of a group of individuals described only as non-compliant assets. The operation had encountered unexpected resistance, resulting in a structural failure at a remote storage facility and the deaths of numerous personnel and detainees alike. The report concluded with a recommendation that the incident be reclassified under existing foreign engagements to prevent public disorder. I looked up, my mouth dry. "This suggests that the threat was internal," Holmes finished, "not foreign, and that the government acted against its own people." "But who were these assets?" I asked. "That," Holmes said, "is the question that cost Thomas Langdale his life. The document included a location, an abandoned munitions depot in the countryside north of London, decommissioned shortly after the incident and officially recorded as having suffered a minor fire. "We shall go there," Holmes said. The journey took us by train and then by carriage along narrow country roads bordered by leafless hedgerows. The sky hung low and grey, the air heavy with the promise of rain. As we approached the site, an oppressive stillness settled upon the landscape, as though the land itself remembered what had occurred there. The depot lay partially concealed by overgrowth, its brick walls blackened by age and neglect. A rusted gate hung open, creaking softly in the wind. Holmes dismounted and surveyed the area with keen attention. "Note the ground," he said. "Uneven, disturbed long after official abandonment." We entered the main structure, our footsteps echoing in the vast empty space. The smell of damp and decay was pervasive. Holmes moved methodically, examining walls, floors, and beams. "Here," he said, indicating a section of wall. "Fire damage. Localized, intense. Not consistent with an accidental blaze." "And here," I added, pointing to a series of marks on the floor. "Drag marks." Holmes nodded. "Bodies moved, selectively." In a smaller adjoining chamber, we found something that caused even Holmes to pause. A series of names etched faintly into the brickwork, as though carved with desperate urgency. Dozens of them. "These," Holmes said quietly, "are not the names on our list." "But some are similar," I observed. "Variations, misspellings." "Aliases," Holmes replied, "or names assumed after the fact. These were the detainees." "Why were they here?" I asked. Holmes straightened slowly. "Because they knew something, or because they were believed to." As we stood there, a sound reached us from outside, the crunch of gravel underfoot. Holmes extinguished his lantern at once, motioning for silence. Through a crack in the doorway, I saw two figures approaching, both men, both armed. They moved with the confidence of those accustomed to obedience. "They anticipated our curiosity," Holmes whispered. We retreated deeper into the structure, moving with care. Holmes led me through a narrow passage I had not noticed before, emerging at the rear of the building. From there, we circled back through the undergrowth, eventually reaching the carriage unseen. We did not speak until we were well on our way back to London. "They are no longer content to observe," I said. "No," Holmes agreed. "They are containing." That night, Holmes worked with feverish intensity, comparing the names etched into the wall with obscure records. Poorhouse admissions, asylum registers, burial permits. "These people did not die," he said finally. "At least, not all of them. Many were released quietly, their identities altered, their memories discredited." "And the rest?" I asked. Holmes's voice was grave. "Were buried under classifications and euphemisms." A knock came at the door, soft, cautious. Holmes stiffened. Mrs. Hudson admitted a young man, pale and trembling. "They told me you could help," he said. "My grandfather was there, at the depot." Holmes gestured him inside. "Sit down. Tell us everything." As the young man spoke, recounting fragmented stories passed down in whispers of detention, interrogation, and terror, I felt the final pieces of the puzzle begin to align. The conspiracy was no longer abstract. It had names, places, victims, and now it had witnesses. Holmes listened without interruption, his expression unreadable. When the young man finished, Holmes spoke softly. "The truth," he said, "has survived longer than they expected." Outside, the fog thickened once more, pressing against the windows as though eager to reclaim its secrets. But I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that the silence Britain had so carefully maintained was beginning to fracture. And when it broke, the sound would be deafening. The young man who had come to us that night gave his name as Jonathan Pierce. He was scarcely 25, slight of build, with eyes that bore the look of one who has grown accustomed to weighing every word before allowing it into the world. As he sat before us, hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles shone white, I was struck by the impression that fear had long been a familiar companion to him. Not the sudden terror of a single shock, but the slow inherited dread passed down through generations. "My grandfather's name was Elias Pierce," he began. "At least, that was the name he died under." Holmes inclined his head. "And before that?" Jonathan swallowed. He said he had been called something else. He never told us what. Only that his true name had been taken from him and that it was safer not to look for it. Holmes's gaze sharpened. Did he ever speak of the depot? Jonathan nodded. In fragments. He would wake in the night shouting about walls and fire, about men screaming orders he could not understand. When I was a boy, I thought them dreams. But as he grew older, he became careless. He said he had been held with others, that they were accused of conspiring against the crown. On what grounds? I asked. Jonathan shook his head. He never knew. He was a railway clerk. His only crime was being on a list. Holmes leaned forward. A list compiled how? Jonathan hesitated. He said it had something to do with letters. Letters he sorted, documents he moved. He once said, I carried secrets without knowing they were secrets. Holmes and I exchanged a glance. Did your grandfather ever tell you how he was released? Holmes asked. Yes, Jonathan said. After the fire. He said there was chaos. Some guards were dead. Others fled. Then men arrived. Different men. They separated the survivors. Some were taken away. Some were told new names and new histories. My grandfather was warned that if he ever spoke, everyone he loved would suffer. And did he speak? Holmes asked softly. Jonathan shook his head. Not publicly, only to me, near the end. He said the silence was breaking him, that the truth wanted to be remembered. Holmes rose and paced the room slowly. Your grandfather was not unique, he said. He was one of many. Yes, Jonathan replied, and that is why I came, because there are others like him, families who have stories that don't align, men who lived as ghosts. Holmes stopped and turned. How many? Jonathan hesitated. I don't know exactly, but I've spoken to at least 6, quietly, all different backgrounds, all detained around the same time, all warned into silence. Holmes's expression was grave. You have done something very dangerous. Jonathan met his gaze steadily. So did my grandfather. He said someone had to remember. When Jonathan had left, Holmes remained standing for a long time, his fingers steepled, his eyes fixed upon a point beyond the walls of Baker Street. They underestimated the human element, he said at last. Records can be altered, names can be erased, but memory resists. And yet, I said, memory alone proves little. Which is why, Holmes replied, we must find corroboration that cannot be dismissed as sentiment or delusion. He turned to his desk and selected several files. We now have 3 categories of evidence. First, altered documents. Second, witness testimony. Third, he paused. We require a living architect of the operation. You believe such a man still lives? I asked. I believe, Holmes said, that men who orchestrate such measures rarely remove themselves from the world. They thrive in it. Over the next days, Holmes's inquiries took on a new intensity. He traced promotions, retirements, and unexplained honors bestowed in the years following 1871. Patterns emerged. Men elevated suddenly, rewarded discreetly, then placed in positions where oversight was minimal, but influence remained considerable. One name recurred with unsettling regularity, Colonel Matthew Harrowby. He appears everywhere, Holmes remarked, tapping the file. Rail transport coordination, internal security advisement, colonial logistics, always adjacent to crisis, never accountable for it. And now? I asked. Now, Holmes replied. He is a respected retiree living quietly in Kensington, a man above suspicion. We paid our first visit under the guise of a social call, Holmes presenting himself as a researcher of military history. Harrowby received us in a drawing room adorned with medals and photographs. He was a tall man, well preserved for his age, with eyes that were sharp despite the silvering of his hair. "You're interested in March of '71, Harrowby said, after Holmes had steered the conversation carefully. "An unremarkable period." Holmes smiled politely. Unremarkable periods often conceal the most instructive lessons. Harrowby's gaze flickered. "One must be careful not to read too much into administrative gaps." "Or too little," Holmes replied. The interview yielded nothing overt. Harrowby was courteous, controlled, and scrupulously vague. Yet, as we departed, Holmes's expression was thoughtful rather than disappointed. He recognized the danger, Holmes said, but not the source. That night, Holmes revealed the next stage of his plan. "We shall force corroboration," he said, "by bringing two strands together that were never meant to meet." He arranged a meeting, ostensibly accidental, between Jonathan Pierce and another descendant of a detainee, one who had recently come into possession of an old trunk containing papers never officially recorded. Holmes ensured that word of this meeting would reach certain attentive ears. "They are listening," he said. "Let us give them something to hear." The meeting took place in a rented room above a bookseller's shop. I attended, though Holmes remained elsewhere, content to observe from a distance. The papers were unremarkable at first glance. Letters, receipts, a few sketches. Then one letter caught my eye, a description of the depot written days before the incident, mentioning Colonel Harrowby by name as overseeing the transfer. This was the corroboration Holmes sought. Within hours, the response came. Two men attempted to retrieve the papers by force. They were intercepted, not by the police, but by Holmes himself, who had anticipated their move and arranged matters accordingly. When Holmes returned to Baker Street that night, his eyes shone with a cold satisfaction. "They have confirmed everything," he said. "Not by what they said, but by what they attempted." "And now?" I asked. Holmes's expression grew somber. "Now comes the most delicate phase, to uncover the truth without unleashing consequences that may prove uncontrollable." He stood by the window, gazing out at the sleeping city. "Britain kept this silent," he said, "not because it was trivial, but because it was intolerable." I felt then the full weight of what we were confronting. Not merely a crime, but a choice, made long ago, maintained by generations, and now trembling on the brink of exposure. And the question that haunted me was not whether Holmes could uncover the truth. It was whether the truth, once uncovered, could be borne at all. The revelation of Colonel Harrowby's name, set down so plainly in ink that had survived where so many official records had not, marked a subtle yet unmistakable shift in the character of the case. Up to that point, we had been contending with systems, with abstractions, files altered, names reassigned, silences enforced. Now, for the first time, the conspiracy possessed a human center that could be approached, questioned, and, if fortune allowed, cornered. Holmes was acutely aware of the danger implicit in this transition. Institutions are ponderous and slow to react. Men, especially those long accustomed to command, can be swift and ruthless. Colonel Harrowby is not merely a participant, Holmes observed, as we sat late into the night, papers spread between us. He is a node. Remove him and the structure trembles, but does not collapse. Confront him incautiously and the structure hardens. You believe he will speak? I asked. Holmes regarded me thoughtfully, not out of remorse, but out of pride. The next morning, Holmes paid a second visit to Harrowby's residence, this time alone. I protested, but he dismissed my concern with a raised hand. This conversation, he said, must be conducted without witness. If I succeed, you will hear of it. If I fail, he smiled thinly, you will have larger matters to attend to. The hours that followed were among the longest of my life. I busied myself with reviewing notes, but my attention wandered incessantly to the clock. At last, well into the afternoon, the door opened and Holmes entered, his expression composed but drawn. He spoke, Holmes said simply. I exhaled. And? Holmes removed his coat deliberately, as though grounding himself in routine. He did not deny the incident, nor did he deny his role. He denied only its criminality. Holmes recounted the meeting in careful detail. Harrowby, confronted with the letter bearing his name, had at first attempted deflection, suggesting forgery, misinterpretation, historical context. When Holmes presented corroborating testimony, timelines, and evidence of subsequent suppression, the Colonel's posture shifted. He framed it, Holmes said, as necessity, a preemptive containment of what was believed to be a domestic insurrection. Believed? I echoed. Yes. Intelligence suggested a coordinated movement among transport workers, clerks, and logistics personnel, men positioned to disrupt supply lines. The evidence was thin, the fear substantial. So, innocent men were detained, I said, on suspicion alone. Detained, interrogated, and confined, Holmes replied. The depot was intended as a temporary holding facility. The fire, whether accidental or provoked, transformed misjudgment into catastrophe. And afterward, I asked. Holmes's eyes hardened. Afterward, the priority became survival of the state's credibility. The dead were too numerous to explain away individually. The living were too dangerous to release unchanged. And Langdale, I pressed. Holmes paused. Harrowby admitted that Langdale's discoveries alarmed him. He did not order the man's death, but he sanctioned preventative measures. In his mind, that distinction absolves him. I felt a surge of anger. So, he considers himself blameless. He considers himself necessary, Holmes corrected. In the days that followed, Holmes assembled what he termed a closed narrative, a complete accounting of the events of March 1871 and their aftermath, supported by documents, testimony, and logical inference. It was not a document intended for publication. Rather, it was a record designed to be undeniable to those capable of understanding it. He requested a private audience with Sir Reginald Ashcroft. The meeting took place in a room whose windows were shuttered despite the daylight. Ashcroft listened without interruption as Holmes laid out the case from beginning to end. When Holmes concluded, the silence was profound. "You have done what you were warned not to do," Ashcroft said at last. "I have done what was necessary," Holmes replied. Ashcroft folded his hands. "What do you want?" Holmes's answer was unexpected. Acknowledgement and cessation. Ashcroft frowned. "You do not intend to expose this publicly?" "No," Holmes said. "Exposure would punish the wrong generation, but silence, maintained indefinitely, corrodes the present." Ashcroft considered this. And Langdale. Holmes's voice softened. His name must be cleared, quietly. His family compensated honestly, and the remaining witnesses left unmolested. Ashcroft leaned back. You ask for much. I ask for balance, Holmes replied. After a long pause, Ashcroft nodded. Very well. The record will remain sealed, but certain internal corrections can be made. Holmes rose. That will suffice. When he returned to Baker Street that evening, he seemed older somehow, burdened by the knowledge he carried. You could have forced them, I said. You had the means. Holmes shook his head. Forcing truth upon an unprepared society can be an act of cruelty. And justice? I asked. Justice, Holmes said quietly, is not always synonymous with revelation. That night, Holmes burned several pages of his notes, retaining only a single bound manuscript, which he placed in his strongbox. For the future, he said, should the balance tip again. As I write these words now, I understand why this case was never published among Holmes's celebrated adventures. It did not end with handcuffs or courtroom triumphs. It ended with an understanding, uneasy, incomplete, and profoundly human. Yet sometimes I think of the names etched into brick, the men who lived as ghosts, and the truth that hovered always just beneath the surface of official memory. Britain kept silent. But Sherlock Holmes did not forget. If I were to claim that matters settled cleanly after Holmes's audience with Sir Reginald Ashcroft, I should be guilty of precisely the sort of convenient fiction that lay at the heart of this entire affair. Silence, once disturbed, does not resume its former shape without resistance. It presses back, it adapts. And in those weeks that followed, we learned that even a conspiracy willing to compromise does not relinquish its instincts overnight. Holmes himself appeared outwardly unchanged. He resumed his violin in the evenings, accepted lesser cases with a professional detachment, and spoke little of Colonel Harrowby or the depot north of London. Yet I observed signs that told a different story. His habit of pausing mid-sentence as though listening for something beyond the room. His increased attention to correspondence before burning it unread. His tendency to walk Baker Street at irregular hours, alone and without explanation. They are adjusting, he remarked one evening when I ventured to comment upon these peculiarities. Any organism does when threatened. Threatened by what? I asked. You agreed to discretion? Yes, Holmes replied. But discretion cuts both ways. They know now that the truth exists in a coherent form, and that knowledge is uncomfortable. The first sign of resistance came disguised as courtesy. Edward Langdale called upon us one afternoon, his manner anxious but controlled. He had received, he told us, a letter from the Admiralty expressing regret for the manner in which his brother's death had been handled. A modest sum of compensation was offered, framed as an acknowledgement of administrative oversight. They want me to sign a statement, Langdale said, handing Holmes the letter, affirming that I accept the official conclusion. Holmes read the letter carefully. And do you intend to? Langdale hesitated. I want closure, he said, but I do not want to lie. Holmes nodded. Then you shall do neither. Accept the compensation, decline the statement. Silence, in this instance, is not dishonesty. Langdale exhaled in relief. They will not press. They will probe, Holmes said, but they will not press. To do so would draw attention. Langdale departed, reassured but not comforted. When he was gone, I remarked upon the careful phrasing of the letter. They are formalizing the boundary, Holmes said, marking where inquiry must cease. And will it? I asked. Holmes's expression was inscrutable. For some, yes. For others, never. Within days, Jonathan Pierce returned, visibly shaken. 2 men had come to his lodging, he said, polite but insistent, inquiring about his grandfather's health and his own associations. They had suggested, kindly, that he might benefit from employment abroad. They know about the meeting, Jonathan said. About the papers. Holmes's eyes narrowed. Did you give them anything? No, Jonathan replied, but they were not asking. Holmes dismissed him with instructions to remain vigilant and to leave London's if approached again. Afterward, he sat in silence for a long time, fingers pressed together. They are attempting containment without overt force, he said at last. A refinement of old habits. That same week brought another development, one that troubled Holmes more deeply than he cared to admit. A notice appeared in several academic journals, announcing a forthcoming revision of certain historical analyses relating to British logistics in the early 1870s. The language was dry, scholarly, and entirely misleading. They are rewriting, I said. Yes, Holmes replied, proactively. What good does that do them? I asked. The original documents are already curated, Holmes interrupted. What they fear is interpretation, memory made articulate. He stood abruptly. We must ensure that at least one uncontested account exists. You said yourself that publication would be destructive. I did, Holmes agreed. Public revelation would be, but preservation is another matter. That night, Holmes removed the bound manuscript from his strongbox, the same document he had spared from the fire weeks earlier. He reviewed it page by page, making additions in the margins, clarifying references, strengthening chains of inference. This, he said, tapping the cover, is not for the present. It is for a moment when denial becomes impossible. And if that moment never comes? I asked. Holmes looked up at me. Then history will proceed as it always has, imperfectly. The danger, however, was not confined to ideas. Late one evening, as I returned alone from a patient in Bloomsbury, I became aware that I was being followed. The steps behind me were measured, unhurried. I turned abruptly into a side street, then another. The steps followed. At last, I stopped and faced my pursuer. He was a man of middle years, plainly dressed, his expression polite. "Dr. Watson," he said, "please forgive the intrusion." "What do you want?" I demanded. "Only to ensure your continued well-being," he replied. "Certain inquiries can have unintended consequences." I laughed harshly. "Is that a threat?" He smiled. "A reminder." The following morning, Holmes listened to my account without visible surprise. "They are reminding us of our vulnerability," he said. "That is a sign of restraint, not aggression." "You find that reassuring?" I asked. "I find it informative," Holmes replied. He began then to take precautions, not dramatic ones, but subtle. Papers were duplicated and stored separately. Certain facts were committed to memory alone. Holmes instructed me in methods of concealment and communication I had hoped never to require. "You are preparing for flight," I said. "No," Holmes corrected, "for persistence." Despite these measures, there were moments when the strain showed. One night, as Holmes played his violin with unusual intensity, I remarked upon the melancholy of the melody. "It is an old lament," he said, "for truths acknowledged too late." "Do you regret not exposing everything?" I asked. Holmes lowered the violin. Regret is a luxury afforded to those who believe in perfect outcomes. The case, then, did not end. It receded. It embedded itself within the structures it had challenged, altering them subtly but irrevocably. Men like Harrowby faded from influence. Others learned caution. Families like the Pierces learned that they were not alone. And Holmes. Holmes carried the knowledge forward, as he always did, as both burden and safeguard. Yet even now, as I set down these recollections, I am conscious of an unresolved tension. For if silence can adapt, so too can truth. And I cannot help but wonder whether the conspiracy Britain kept silent about truly ended, or whether it merely learned once again how to wait. The winter returned with an insistence that felt personal. London's cold that year was not merely sharp, but insinuating, finding its way through stone and bone alike, and with it came a sense, unwelcome yet familiar, that the affair we believed contained had found new avenues of motion. Holmes, who had long maintained that conspiracies do not end so much as change shape, appeared neither surprised nor dismayed when the next disturbance announced itself. He was, if anything, grimly attentive, as a physician might be when a fever breaks only to reveal a deeper infection. The disturbance arrived in the form of absence. I had called at the Public Record Office on a minor professional errand, an entirely unrelated matter concerning a military pension, when an archivist with whom Holmes had once exchanged pleasantries recognized my name and drew me aside. The man was pale, his fingers ink-stained and trembling. "Dr. Watson," he said in a whisper, "there has been a removal." I confess that my first thought was pedestrian, theft, perhaps, or bureaucratic misplacement. Yet the manner of the archivist's speech suggested something more profound. "What sort of removal?" I asked. He glanced about him, then leaned closer. "A file," he said. "A sealed file. One that does not circulate. One that officially does not exist." My pulse quickened. "And you know this how?" "Because I catalogued the shadow index," he replied. "A private task. I was instructed to forget it afterward." He swallowed. "The file was there last week. Yesterday it was gone." I left at once and returned to Baker Street, where Holmes listened to my account with eyes that had already anticipated the conclusion. "They are consolidating," he said, "or correcting an error." "What error?" I asked. Holmes did not answer immediately. Instead, he retrieved his strongbox and removed the bound manuscript, placing it upon the table between us. "Errors," he said at last, "are anything that exists in more than one place." He opened the manuscript and compared it to a slim notebook he kept apart from the rest, a private ledger of cross-references, coded dates, and names whose meanings were known only to him. His finger paused upon a notation made weeks earlier. "Here," he said, "a citation to an internal review conducted in 1883. That review must have produced a file which someone now believes should be singular." "You think they are hunting copies?" I asked. "I think," Holmes replied, "they are discovering that suppression is not deletion." That evening, Holmes sent discreet messages through channels he rarely employed, summoning individuals whose skills lay not in deduction, but in movement. Men and women who knew how records traveled, how offices breathed after hours, how authority could be imitated convincingly enough to pass unnoticed. He did not tell me precisely whom he contacted, nor where. Holmes had always understood that knowledge, to be protected, must sometimes be compartmentalized even among allies. 2 nights later, a man arrived at Baker Street who gave his name only as H. He was young, sharp-eyed, and possessed of a confidence that suggested long familiarity with risk. "They removed the file themselves," H reported. "No break-in, no false signatures. The order came from inside." "Destination?" Holmes asked. "Unknown," H replied. "But I heard something else. A review committee is being formed." Holmes's lips pressed thin. "A committee reviews in order to revise. Or to bury," I said. "Or," Holmes added quietly, "to find what has survived burial." The implication was clear. Holmes's manuscript, his carefully assembled, quietly preserved account, had become a liability, not because it was known, but because it might be known. Somewhere within the apparatus of the state, an intelligence had deduced that the danger no longer lay in witnesses or families, but in synthesis. The next development confirmed this suspicion. Sir Reginald Ashcroft sent for Holmes once more. The tone of the summons was courteous, almost apologetic, yet the timing, so soon after the removal of the file, left no doubt as to its significance. Holmes returned from that meeting later than expected, his face pale with concentration. "They wished to see the manuscript," he said without preamble. I felt a tightening in my chest. "On what grounds?" "On the grounds," Holmes replied, "that it exists." "And did you refuse?" Holmes shook his head. "I neither refused nor agreed. I suggested conditions." "What conditions?" "That it be read, not seized, that no copies be made, and that its existence be acknowledged within a restricted circle." "And Ashcroft?" I asked. Holmes sat down heavily. "Is no longer the final authority." That single sentence carried a weight I had not anticipated. "Then who is?" Holmes did not answer directly. "There are moments," he said slowly, "when a system becomes aware of itself, when it recognizes the shape of its own contradictions. Such moments are volatile." Days passed. Holmes received no further word, yet the pressure did not abate. I noticed unfamiliar faces on Baker Street, men who lingered without purpose. Mrs. Hudson remarked upon callers who left without asking questions. Even Holmes's correspondence diminished, as though the world were holding its breath. Then, one evening, Holmes did something I had never seen him do before. He handed me the manuscript. "If anything happens to me," he said calmly, "you must see that this survives." The weight of the pages in my hands was extraordinary. "You believe you are in danger?" "I believe," Holmes replied, "that certainty is now impossible." That night, I did not sleep. I lay awake, listening to the city breathe, acutely aware that the knowledge contained within that manuscript, knowledge of fear, misjudgment, and moral compromise at the heart of power, had become an object of pursuit in its own right. The following morning brought news that altered everything. Colonel Matthew Harrowby was dead. The papers reported it as a peaceful passing in his sleep. Holmes read the notice in silence, then folded the paper with deliberate care. "They are closing accounts," he said. "Or silencing him," I suggested. Holmes shook his head. Harrowby had already spoken, to me. His value lay not in secrecy, but in precedent. "Then why now?" I asked. Holmes looked at me gravely. "Because the past has begun to move." Within hours, Holmes learned, through channels obscure and indirect, that the removed file had not been destroyed. It had been relocated to a private archive under special review, and that review was not administrative, but judicial in nature. They are considering responsibility, Holmes said. Not publicly, but internally. For what? I asked. For allowing the truth to persist. The irony was not lost on me. An apparatus that had once concealed a tragedy now feared its own concealment might be judged. That evening, Holmes made a decision that startled me. "We will do nothing," he said. "Nothing?" I repeated. "For the moment," Holmes clarified. "Intervention now would confirm their fears. Silence, judiciously applied, can also be a weapon." He returned the manuscript to the strongbox, but I noted that he placed a marker within its pages. "A contingency," he said, following my gaze. And so we waited. Yet waiting, I learned, is not passivity. It is tension sustained over time. And in that tension, I felt the truth pressing outward, not as a revelation, but as a question. How long, I wondered, can a nation keep silent about itself before the silence begins to speak? Waiting, as Holmes had warned me, was not an absence of action, but a discipline of restraint. Days passed with an unnatural smoothness, as though the city itself had been instructed to behave. The newspapers were dull to the point of parody. Parliament debated matters of tariff and rail subsidy with an enthusiasm that felt rehearsed. Even the weather seemed to cooperate, delivering a succession of colourless mornings and obedient evenings. Yet beneath this carefully maintained normality, something strained and restless persisted, like a tendon pulled too tight. Holmes rarely spoke during this period, but when he did, his remarks were precise and edged with a gravity I had come to associate with moments of irreversible transition. "They are attempting to determine," he said one night, as he adjusted the lamp and resumed his pacing, "whether truth is more dangerous than its concealment." "And what is their conclusion?" I asked. Holmes stopped. "That depends on who controls it." The first tangible sign that matters were moving again came not through Holmes's channels, but through my own. A former colleague from my army days, a man now employed in a clerical capacity at the War Office, requested a private meeting. His letter was brief, his handwriting unusually cramped. "I have seen something I should not have seen," it read. "I fear it concerns you and Mr. Holmes. We met at a public house near Charing Cross, chosen for its noise and anonymity. My acquaintance, whom I shall call Bennett, appeared agitated, his fingers tracing the rim of his glass without lifting it. They are circulating names," he said at once. "Not for arrest, for assessment." "Assessment of what?" I asked. "Of risk," Bennett replied. "Your name, Holmes, several others." My heart sank. "On what grounds?" "Possession of knowledge," he said simply. I returned to Baker Street at once. Holmes listened without interruption, his face grave but unsurprised. "Yes," he said, "the final phase." "What does that mean?" I demanded. Holmes folded his arms. "It means that the truth is no longer merely suppressed. It is being evaluated as a destabilizing force." "And if they judge it so?" I asked. "Then they will seek to neutralize it," Holmes replied. "Not by destruction, but by discredit." The words struck me with sudden clarity. "They will undermine witnesses, challenge sanity, question motives." "Exactly," Holmes said. "Truth does not need to be disproved, only rendered implausible." Within days, the strategy became apparent. An article appeared in a respected quarterly. discussing the psychological unreliability of generational trauma and the tendency of families to mythologize personal grievances. Though no names were mentioned, the parallels were unmistakable. Another essay followed, suggesting that late Victorian administrative practices had been unfairly maligned by modern sensibilities. "They are preparing the intellectual ground," I said bitterly. "They are insulating themselves," Holmes corrected, "by making disbelief respectable." Then came the most troubling development of all. Jonathan Pierce disappeared, not dramatically. No signs of struggle, no alarming reports. He simply failed to appear at his lodgings, missed appointments, ceased to exist within the ordinary mechanisms of daily life. Holmes made inquiries immediately, quietly, with increasing urgency. "No records," he said after 2 days. "No departure registered, no arrest logged." "You think they took him?" I asked. Holmes hesitated. "I think they offered him a choice." A week later, Jonathan reappeared, or rather, a version of him did. He sent a letter from Hamburg, stating that he had accepted employment overseas and wished no further contact. The tone was polite, detached, almost sterile. Holmes read it once, then burned it. "They have refined the method," he said. "No prisons, no martyrs, only erasure through opportunity." "And what of the manuscript?" I asked. "Surely that remains a threat." Holmes nodded. "Which is why it must now change its function." He removed the manuscript from the strongbox and placed it upon the table. For the first time since its creation, he altered it significantly, not by adding new evidence, but by obscuring certain paths of inference, embedding conclusions within a maze of contextual detail. "You are weakening it," I said, astonished. "I am disguising it," Holmes replied, "making it unreadable to those who seek a weapon, but invaluable to those who seek understanding." That night, Holmes did something else entirely unexpected. He arranged for copies, not of the manuscript itself, but of selected innocuous sections, to be deposited anonymously in 3 separate academic institutions, each fragment incomplete on its own. "Seeds," he said, "harmless individually, irreversible collectively." I began to understand. The truth would not arrive as a revelation, but as a gradual discomfort, a series of questions arising independently, too diffuse to suppress. Yet the danger remained immediate. One evening, as Holmes and I walked along the embankment, a carriage drew alongside us and slowed. A man leaned out, his voice low and urgent. "Mr. Holmes," he said, "you are requested." Holmes halted. "By whom?" The man hesitated. "By those who have tolerated you thus far." Holmes studied him, then shook his head. "I do not accept invitations issued in fear." The carriage moved on. "That," Holmes said as we resumed walking, "was an attempt to reassert authority." "And you refused?" I said. "Because authority," Holmes replied, "has now become defensive." The following morning brought confirmation. Sir Reginald Ashcroft resigned. The announcement cited health concerns, but Holmes read between the lines with ease. "They are reorganizing," he said, "removing intermediaries who remember compromise." "And replacing them with what?" I asked. Holmes's eyes were dark. "With men who believe silence is virtue." That night, Holmes took a final precaution. He prepared a sealed packet, addressed not to any official body, but to a private trustee whose discretion was legendary. "If this is opened," Holmes said as he handed it to me for inspection, "it will mean that silence has failed." I felt the full weight of the moment then. Not triumph, not despair, but something colder and more enduring. We had not won, nor had we lost. We had altered the balance. The conspiracy Britain kept silent about was no longer intact, but neither was it exposed. It existed now in a state of tension, known to enough, denied by many, feared by those who understood it best. As Holmes extinguished the lamp that night, he spoke one last sentence that has remained with me ever since. The most dangerous truths, he said, are not those that overthrow governments, but those that force them to recognize themselves. And with that recognition, I sensed that the end was near, not of the conspiracy, but of our role within it. It is an odd thing, looking back upon the final phase of that affair, to recognize how little of it was marked by overt drama. No arrests were made in public view. No trials unfolded beneath the gaslights. No confession rang out in a crowded chamber to be immortalized by the penny press. Instead, the conclusion, if such a word can be honestly applied, arrived quietly through absences, silences, and choices not taken. Yet I have come to believe that it was precisely this quietness that gave the ending its terrible weight. The sealed packet Holmes prepared remained unopened. Weeks passed, then months. London shifted into another season, and with it came a gradual loosening of the tension that had drawn the city tight as a drawn wire. The unfamiliar faces on Baker Street vanished. The callers who asked no questions ceased to call. Holmes's correspondence resumed its usual volume, though I noticed that certain names never again appeared among the addresses. The world, it seemed, had agreed, without ever speaking of it, to look elsewhere. Holmes himself appeared diminished in one respect and enlarged in another. The restless pacing gave way to long periods of stillness. He played his violin less frequently, but when he did, the melodies were no longer laments. They were complex, searching pieces, as though he were exploring unfamiliar emotional territory with the same analytical rigor he once reserved for chemical formulas and footprints in the mud. One evening, as we sat together by the fire, I ventured to ask the question that had haunted me since the beginning. "Holmes," I said, "did we do enough?" He regarded me thoughtfully. "Enough for what purpose?" "For justice," I replied. Holmes considered this. "Justice," he said slowly, "is not a monolith. It has forms. Some are suited to courts and gallows. Others are suited only to memory." "And which did this require?" I asked. Holmes rose and crossed to the window, gazing out at the familiar curve of Baker Street. "This required containment," he said. "Not of truth, but of damage." "You mean the damage truth would cause?" I said. "No," Holmes corrected gently. "The damage denial had already caused, and would cause again if left unchallenged." I realized then that the case had never truly been about exposure. It had been about interruption. The conspiracy Britain had kept silent about had relied upon a particular assumption, that silence, once imposed, would remain unbroken forever. Holmes had shattered that assumption, not by shouting, but by ensuring that the silence was no longer complete. The consequences manifested gradually. Within a year, several obscure policy changes were enacted regarding archival oversight and internal review. They were framed as modernization efforts, but Holmes read them as admissions. Quiet reparations were extended to families whose histories had long been marred by inexplicable absences. Certain academic debates, once dismissed as fringe, were granted cautious legitimacy. And the witnesses? Those who remained in England were left alone. Those who had accepted opportunities abroad were neither pursued nor punished. They became what the system preferred them to be: dispersed truths, inconvenient but unthreatening. Of Colonel Harrowby, little more was said. His papers were sealed indefinitely. His medals remained on the wall of his drawing room until his estate passed into other hands. Yet, in one small but telling detail, Holmes detected an alteration that pleased him greatly. They have removed his commendation for exceptional domestic security, Holmes observed one morning, having perused a revised register. It is a footnote, but an honest one. And Sir Reginald Ashcroft? I asked. Lives quietly, Holmes replied, and will never again be trusted with silence. As for Thomas Langdale, his name was never publicly cleared. There was no grand correction issued, no headline declaring error. Instead, a small adjustment was made in the official registry. His death was reclassified, no longer an accident, but undetermined. To most, it meant nothing. To those who knew, it meant everything. Edward Langdale wrote to us once more, expressing gratitude without embellishment. He did not ask for further explanation, nor did he press for more. I sensed that he understood intuitively that there are victories which cannot be improved by scrutiny. The manuscript remained in Holmes's strongbox. On a quiet afternoon not long thereafter, Holmes surprised me by handing it to me once more. "I have decided," he said, "that you shall be its custodian." I stared at him. "Why me?" "Because you will know when not to use it," Holmes replied. "And if that moment never comes?" I asked. Holmes smiled faintly. "Then we shall have succeeded." I took the manuscript with a reverence I had never before felt for paper and ink. It was heavy, not merely in weight, but in consequence. Within its pages lay not only the record of a hidden tragedy, but the anatomy of a decision. The moment when fear overcame principle, and when principle later struggled, imperfectly, to reassert itself. Years have passed since then. Holmes continues his work, though with greater selectivity. He has grown, I think, more conscious of the moral dimensions of his intellect, less inclined to treat human affairs as puzzles divorced from their aftermath. I have resumed my medical practice in earnest, though I find that my patients' sufferings now appear within a broader, more troubling context. Pain, I have learned, is often administered long before it is felt. As I set down these final words, I do so with the knowledge that they will not be published. Not now, and perhaps not ever. This account, like the manuscript it describes, is intended not for the present, but for a future that may one day require it. Britain kept silent about the conspiracy Holmes uncovered because it believed silence was strength. Holmes proved otherwise, not by breaking the silence entirely, but by teaching it to listen to itself. The truth, once noticed, cannot be wholly unseen. And though it may retreat into footnotes, into altered registers and careful omissions, it remains, patient, persistent, and quietly alive. That, I think, was Holmes's greatest deduction of all.